Aileen Wuornos would terrorize Florida as the highway killer.
She just simply pulled out her gun and pulled him off the road and killed him. 7 men in cold blood.
A hitchhiking prostitute that broke all the rules.
She is said to be the first female serial killer in a non-caregiving capacity.
But was Wuornos driven to murder?
The kids said, look at her, she's already had a baby, she's a prostitute. Nobody should hang out with anybody like that. Didn't realize that she was raped.
Or was she born to kill?
I knew she was messed up, but never did I ever think she'd commit murder.
Aileen Wuornos was born on the 29th of February, 1956. She was abandoned by her mother when just a baby. She and her brother Keith were adopted by their grandparents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos. She would believe they were her real mother and father.
She and her brother both thought her own grandparents were her real parents, and her mother Diane a sister rather than their true mother. This placed the kids, if you like, under a false pretext. At some point they're going to find out that this is not really the case.
Aileen never met her natural father. Leo Pittman was a career criminal and child molester, convicted of the rape of a 7-year-old girl and a suspect in a child murder case.
She never really knew her biological father. Indeed, Aileen Wuornos' natural father was a convicted sex offender. And that does lead to all kinds of questions in relation to, could there have been some kind of genetic predisposition developing here in relation to what would happen to Aileen Wuornos in her life?
Karen Gamble attended the same elementary school as the young Aileen.
I first met Aileen when I was in first grade. And from then on, I fell behind, but she went on. But I remember her always, in every school that I ever went to, Aileen went to school with me. Aileen was a quiet girl, and I knew that she was a troubled girl. No one wanted to play with her when she was little. I always felt sorry for her. But they didn't want to play with her because she would just sit on the little step by the back, door where you go into your class. I think she was like withdrawn. She looked lonely, scared.
Aileen's home life was far from conventional. Although she was close to her grandmother Britta, Laurie Wuornos was a heavy drinker who commanded a strict regime. Aileen would regularly suffer at the hands of the man she thought was her father.
I think he was real abusive to her, the grandfather. He was a real mean man.
Larry held very, very tight reins on the family. His own wife was alcoholic. Alcoholism ran through the family and was almost like basically a daily way of life. On a daily basis, the strict regime that was imposed became militaristic. It was quite, vicious. The beatings were very regular. It was done in a ritual manner. She would have to actually clean the strap that she was beaten with, and she was beaten in quite a pseudo-sexual way. This may have actually loosened her morals, but then again, they may have been fairly loosened already. She did strike up a relationship with her brother, which was sexual and was possibly detected to some degree by her adopted father.
Aileen was considered a wild child with a quick temper.
She didn't have a healthy relationship with anybody, male or female. There was never any sense of attachment emotionally to anyone. There was never any sense of safety and security, which most people and children, especially babies, need desperately.
Her relationship with her brother was clearly dysfunctional, but it was close. Given that she didn't really bond that well, particularly with her adopted father or other individuals, and certainly not with people at school immediately, her brother was the only consistent factor. So she had someone that throughout life she could rely on, and being of a borderline type personality with flying moods and a desperate inner need for someone that was always going to be there predictably for her as a support, Keith fell into that role.
The young Aileen Wuornos rebelled. Escaping through her bedroom window, she would head to a wooded area known by local youths as the Pits.
Oh, there was like 3 little lakes back there, no homes back there, and all of us kids could go back there and start the big bonfires and just party and have our radios on. Kids would pull up at their cars and we would just party all night long.
Here, the pubescent Aileen would remove her clothes and perform sex acts on young neighborhood boys. Her reward, loose change and cigarettes.
The town in which she grew up is white bread America, so to speak, you know, where it looks very sweet and very nice and very quiet. But for her to be doing that was highly unusual. Her sex was a means to an end. Cigarettes, money, a ride.
Aileen Wuornos became known to the neighborhood kids as the Sig Pig.
This was a young girl who was prepared to sell sexual services for cigarettes. This young woman's self-worth, this young woman's understanding of how she could survive in the world was almost totally determined by her willingness to engage in sexual activity inappropriately. This was a young woman who would have got no attention, would have come to no one's notice, would have been given no praise other than attention and praise and notice that came through the sale of sexual services to other people who would have used her for their own particular ends.
At 12 years old, Aileen and her brother Keith discovered the truth about their parentage.
Upon being told that her grandparents were not her real parents and were in fact her grandparents, the sense of deception and the sense that perhaps the whole world was possibly in on some kind of conspiracy against her will have fitted very much into Aileen's experience of life at that point in time.
Fellow teenager Dawn Botkins befriended the troubled Aileen, while the rest of the neighborhood saw her as a promiscuous troublemaker with a fiery temper. Dawn saw Aileen's good side.
She was kind of quiet, but then she'd get drinking too much. And when she'd get drinking too much, she just felt like everybody was after her all the time, which they were. They were always calling her names and stuff like that. Because a couple of times she'd get in fights with the kids. So I would always just stand up for her, you know, just kind of protect her. Otherwise the kids would always be all over her.
In her quest for popularity and acceptance, Aileen was becoming ever more the outcast.
This approach of almost selling herself to gain favour with others and to attract young boys and to feel some kind of esteem that she's wanted had a contradictory effect on her social life. She would desperately try and make some kind of social life for herself. She would actually hold parties, but at those parties she would be the first person to be ejected because most people saw her as being cheap, somebody that they would pay to have sexual activity with, not someone they would have as a girlfriend or as a true friend.
One time, well, Aileen went and got all these goodies and the beer and everything with her money so she could have a party that night. Well, all the kids went to the house to party, and she was so happy that finally she's doing something. All the kids are coming over because she's having a party. They threw her out in the back of the party that she had gotten everything for, and I was thinking, poor thing. I don't know, they just treated her terrible.
Wuornos was performing poorly at school and frequently ran away from home, often sleeping rough or hitchhiking. Selling sex had become the norm.
What I think we should be talking about here is an inappropriate socialization of her as a child, and in particular the sale of sexual services from the age of 10, really put her on a trajectory that would have been very difficult to reverse in the best of circumstances, never mind the circumstances in which she was raised.
But Aileen's dysfunctional childhood was about to get much worse. The childhood of future serial killer Aileen Wuornos had been far from conventional. The daughter of a sex offender, abandoned by her mother, raised by her grandparents, and frequently beaten by the alcoholic grandfather she thought of as her dad. But in 1971, aged just 14, her life was about to take a new twist. Aileen gave birth to a 7-pound baby boy.
I remember her and I and Dawn being downstairs at Dawn's house, and she told us that she had a baby boy, but not much, you know. She says she got to see him as soon as he was born, but that was all.
Given her age, Aileen's son was immediately taken for adoption. She later claimed the pregnancy was the result of being raped.
That's when the kids said, look at her, she's already had a baby, she's a prostitute. Nobody should hang out with anybody like that. Didn't realize that she was raped.
Just months after Aileen had given birth, her grandmother Britta, who had raised Aileen as her own, died of suspected liver failure.
Suddenly, the one person she loved most and loved her unconditionally back had died. And then when she died, the father just went nuts and threw all the kids out of the house, and she had no one. And that's when Aileen she had no place to go.
Kicked out of her home, Aileen was forced to live rough, sleeping in the woods at the end of her street and in a car on a neighbor's drive. She'd go to the local gas station to wash her hair and clean up.
I think it's really important to say that there doesn't seem to be any point in Aileen Wuornos' life where she was living as you and I might live. She lived rough, she lived in the woods, she lived in cars. Her entire life was dominated by her willingness to sell sexual favors. This is a very difficult environment in which to survive. This is a very difficult environment in which to have a sense of self that's based on the moral universe that you and I inhabit. This is a young woman who clearly is going to have a great difficulty in not only surviving in the type of community in which you and I would survive. This is the kind of woman who's never going to prosper, never going to achieve anything. This is the kind of woman who is ultimately always going to die young.
By 15 years old, Wuornos had dropped out of school and began a new life on America's highways.
She was really withdrawn terribly. But I remember she would tell Dawn and I gotta go, you know, and she'd go off hitchhiking, well, by herself, or whatever. You know, she would just take off and go.
Aileen led a nomadic lifestyle, prostituting and hitchhiking from one place to the next. She found happiness of a sort among the hard-drinking, lawless biker gangs of Colorado.
Because of the way that she was brought up, Wuornos was always most comfortable in cultures that were on the margins of society. She liked to live rough in her car by the roadside. She would run with motorcycle gangs. That would allow her to escape a kind of history in the community in which she was raised, in which she had a reputation as Sig Pig. But it would also be a kind of community, this community on the margins, a motorcycle gang, in which she could not only forget that kind of reputation that she once had, but also where she could also live in a culture which would be less judgmental about her behavior, almost encouraging or permitting of the behavior that she had been socialized into engaging with. It's the kind of living on the edge of our existence that became actually the totality of her existence.
In 1976, age 20, Wuornos moved to Florida. The sunshine and golden beaches were an attractive alternative to the harsh Michigan winters. There she continued her life of petty crime and prostitution.
The sense of being free, the sense of not being attached, it may have appealed to her because she didn't stop doing it. She continued to live that lifestyle for most of the years. So obviously it appealed to her in the sense of not having any attachments, any responsibilities. It may have been something that she thrived with.
In July of 1976, Aileen learned that her brother Keith had died of throat cancer. Although Aileen and Keith had geographically drifted apart, he'd remained loyal.
Keith had been down in the VA hospital dying of throat cancer. For some reason, I was down there visiting him. Even though I was married, I'd say to my husband, I gotta go visit Keith, take him cigarettes and candy, whatever he was. And then all of a sudden at the funeral, here comes Aileen. I said, where have you been for this last year? You know, your brother was pretty sick. She had no idea he was that sick.
Aileen lived on the fringes of society in Florida. A chaotic life of long drinking binges, punctuated by flashes of her now famously quick and violent temper.
Whether it was by prostitution, by threat, by theft, she'd been brought up with a history of shoplifting, and she often used her volatile nature, aggressive, sudden turn to violence as a tool to make her way through this. Unfortunately, this was inevitably going to come undone, and as she got more ambitious and as she began to hit bigger targets, the weight of the law was thrown against her.
Around 1:25 p.m. on May the 20th, 1981, a 25-year-old Aileen turned from petty crime to armed robbery. An intoxicated Wuornos took a .22 caliber handgun into a convenience store, held the clerk at gunpoint, and demanded money. She was promptly arrested by police and imprisoned for 3 years.
Prison would be something of a learning curve, really, because she would have actually mixed with other criminals, found out what ordinary criminals are really like, and her more chaotic approach to crime was probably seemed a lot less organised. She would have defended herself quite vehemently with her flying temper and ability to sort of oscillate her moods. But she would also have probably found some solace in females and perhaps realised that her own sexuality was not 100% heterosexual.
In 1983, aged 27, Aileen was released and quickly fell straight back into a hitchhiking, booze-fueled life of crime.
From childhood, she had progressively engaged in drugs, alcohol, to a very high extent, and this became, if you like, her daily fueling of her behaviour and her sustenance. Often these would be probably used as currency for her prostitute behaviour. She would have been, much of the time, drunk in engaging with new individuals. She would probably have found this to be a style of interacting, of entrapping individuals by getting them to buy drinks to get them both drunk when she could actually come to her own.
By the end of the decade, Aileen's crimes would include murder. By the 1980s, future serial killer Aileen Wuornos had been selling sex for more than a decade and had spent time in prison for armed robbery. On the fringes of society, Wuornos continued to prostitute herself to men. But for companionship, she now began to turn to women.
The idea that Aileen perhaps had problems realising her full sexuality was one that was probably buried in the kind of time period she was. She was trying to enact out, go through the process of what should be a relationship, but having a sexual relationship with your brother, having prostitution as a form of relationship with adults, having sex for money as a child, these do not add up to being a proper relationship. And I don't think that she perhaps suddenly turned lesbian halfway through her life. I think the pressures of the kind of existence that she had made her realization of her sexual side orientated towards women far more coherent, far more salient, and I think that's what pushed her finally in that direction.
In the spring of 1986, Aileen, now known as Lee, met 24-year-old hotel maid Tyra Moore.
It was instant love at first sight. In the form of Tyra Moore, you had someone who was less threatening, someone who offered the kind of stability without the kind of I want immediate sex and I will give you this for it. It broke the mold of the way that she'd been interacting with individuals. And to some degree, she would be craving someone to share her existence with.
There's a temptation to see the relationship that she forms with Tyra Moore as simply an acceptable lesbian relationship that's going to bring a form of structure to Wuornos's life. But for me, that always seems a very shaky platform on which to build an understanding of what would then subsequently happen to Wuornos. Right from the start, I don't feel that Wuornos had the underpinning psychological infrastructure to form any kind of permanent relationship. This was somebody who didn't know how to express affection, how to express love, how to give and take, how to deal on a day-to-day basis with another human being in the way that you and I might engage on a day-to-day basis with other human beings.
One of the primary characteristics of someone with a borderline personality is their somewhat vacuous sense of self, and they do need someone and will gravitate, and once they get hold of someone, they will cling to them jealously and strongly and in a very focused manner.
Aileen and Tyra became inseparable, living together, drinking together, and enjoying one of Aileen's favourite pastimes, firing handguns in the woods.
It was dominated by the most forceful nature of her personality. Even though Tyra was far more consistent, holding down a job and doing relatively normal things, she was entranced and she was carried along by Aileen's somewhat more itinerant existence.
I do feel there's also an element in which they normalize unacceptable behavior within that relationship.
By the late 80s, Aileen and Tyra were living in a room at the budget Fairview Motel in Daytona, while Tyra worked as a cleaner at the more upscale Casa del Mar. Now in her 30s, with a lifetime of prostitution behind her, Aileen was beginning to lose her looks. Earning a living as a hooker was becoming increasingly difficult.
There was a lot of frustration because she wasn't able to earn as much as she was when she was younger and more attractive. And she had the pressure from Tyra Moore to make more money. More. She had to go out more. And she wanted to spend time with Tyra. And the only way Tyra would spend time with Lee is if Lee had the money.
Many of Aileen's regular customers were in the military, and with forces heading out to the Gulf, business was bad.
I think there was that high level of frustration, and I think rather than striking out at the one person that she thought of as a family member, she began to strike out at the guys that she picked up.
On November the 30th, 1989, 51-year-old electronics engineer Richard Mallory picked up Aileen Wuornos on the highway.
Her actual normal way of engaging with a male was one of getting drunk, of offering herself as a prostitute, of taking as much money and perhaps even stealing the odd item and being abusive. But she'd also habitually taken to carrying a gun. Maybe Mallory made a slight move in a dominant way that Aileen didn't like, but however it was configured, Aileen took that extra step and shot this guy. Then decided that she was going to make sure he didn't speak to anyone and made sure he was dead.
6 weeks later, Mallory's body was found dumped in woodland north of Daytona Beach. Heat and insects had taken their toll. The body was badly decomposed. Using a .22 caliber handgun from her purse, Wuornos had unloaded 4 shots into Mallory's chest and back, one bullet striking his left lung, causing a fatal hemorrhage. Before fleeing the scene in Mallory's Cadillac, Wuornos stole Mallory's possessions and covered his lifeless body with a piece of carpet.
I always feel that the first in a series of murders tells us a great deal about how the pattern of murders will develop over the next few weeks, few months. It can clearly be an accident, that first murder. But if the person isn't stopped as a result of that first murder, what they begin to realize is effectively they breathe out. They're holding their breath because they're expecting to be arrested, and then when they're not, they breathe out. And for some killers, by breathing out and not being arrested, they interpret that as, well, let's do it again.
It's a little bit like taking a hit of a drug to which you become addicted. It's similar to what happens in the brain to need more and more and more until you just can't get enough.
In November 1989, after a life of abuse, crime and prostitution, Aileen Wuornos had picked up 51-year-old Richard Mallory on the highway, taken him to the woods for sex, shot him dead, and robbed him.
Everybody has that breaking point, and I think that she finally just snapped.
On June the 1st, 1990, the body of 43-year-old construction worker David Spears was discovered by an illegal trash dump in Citrus County, naked but for his cap. He had been shot 6 times and robbed.
Committing these murders, Aileen had a massive advantage of surprise. These individuals were guys, they were in their own vehicle, they felt empowered. This was just a prostitute they'd picked up. They would not have expected a gun to come from the bag. You do not expect a female serial killer.
June the 6th, 40-year-old rodeo worker Charles Cascadden was found dead in Pasco County. He'd been robbed and shot 9 times with a handgun.
We don't know if she felt that killing these individuals in Florida and taking their cars and their money and everything was just a continued pattern from what she had been doing since she was 9 years old, with no remorse, no sense of anguish, no sense that she needed to make up for these crimes. It was just something she did.
The body of 65-year-old part-time missionary Peter Symes was never found. But his car was. On the 4th of July, 1990, 2 women were seen to abandon it after swerving off the road and crashing near Orange Springs.
These were men that were traveling on the highways and byways of Central Florida, the rural interstates, so to speak. Men that were typically older, in their 50s and 60s, men that were lonely and more desperate to seek the company of a woman.
The string of 4 murders left police baffled.
At first, of course, when you have these, when they're scattered, if they all occur in one community, it's much easier to realize you're dealing with a serial killer. In this case, they were spread over better than 100 miles. Serial killers often operate in that fashion. They won't kill sometimes in their hometown or in their home area. They may drive 2 hours or 4 hours or go away for the weekend and kill someone somewhere else and come back. This was one of those instances where we did find the first body in Daytona Beach, but other than that, we didn't realize we had a serial killer until we began to pool our resources.
There was a lot of pressure on law enforcement to solve this because here was this woman, this prostitute. They knew the circumstances, they could see the pattern emerging, and they could not find who this was.
Back in Daytona, Aileen would pawn her victims' possessions, sharing the proceeds with Tyra, and boozing in biker bars. Her favorite, The Last Resort, just a short walk from their motel. Al Bulling is the bar's owner.
This was a place where she felt comfortable to relax and have a few drinks and end of a day's work, if whatever you want to call it. We sat down and talked, and she played the jukebox at the time, and if she got out of control, loud like anybody else, we just told them, hey, quiet down, and she quieted down and really had no problems with her whatsoever. She never let on what she did. We never asked what she did. We could care less. And she started coming in with Ty. At that time was her girlfriend and stuff like that. And Ty's just a typical woman. She just wanted everything in the world, and Aileen tried to give it to her, and needless to say, it didn't work out.
In July, 50-year-old Troy Barres, a salesman, was found dead in a wooded area in Marion County. He had been shot twice.
The ultimate aim was just to get rid of the stuff, to get money, to get it to Tyria, to further their existence as a daily thing. Killing had just become a way of life.
On the 12th of September 1990, 2 teenage boys were riding bicycles aimlessly around the streets and cul-de-sacs of Marion County. It was 91 degrees and had been raining. As they turned into a dead end, they found 56-year-old former police chief Dick Humphreys. He was dead, shot 6 times in the head and torso.
She was somewhat shambolic, a very disorganised killer, as we would call them. She was disorganised in her daily life. She was not a great planner. Her idea of consequences were far too complex. She could not control the chaotic lifestyle, the chaotic way she committed crimes. Anyone who was perhaps more ritually involved with a murder would possibly have retained aspects and would have made the crime scene their own. With Aileen, her killings were just purely and simply for profit.
In November, the body of 62-year-old police reserve Gino Antonio was found in Dixie County, naked, except for his socks. He'd been shot in the head and back 4 times. With the various law enforcement agencies pooling their resources, they began to focus on the car belonging to Peter Symes that had been crashed and dumped in July.
Became suspicious when they wrecked one of the cars from one of the victims, and they were seen walking away by several passing motorists and people. And so then we realized that car came from the killing scene, a different jurisdiction, but it looked like it was 2 females probably, and that put us on the right track.
With the net closing in, Wuornos took her handgun and threw the murder weapon from the bridge into Rose Bay. But Wuornos had been careless. On the 6th of December, she had pawned a camera belonging to her first victim, Richard Mallory. Although she'd used an alias, she was required by law to provide a thumbprint, and police were able to trace her true identity. On January the 8th, 1991, Aileen was spotted by 2 undercover police officers. They followed her to the Last Resort bar, where she was drinking heavily.
It was a cold January night, like in '91. She really had no place to stay, so when he closed up the bar, I had some trailers sitting out here in the back. And I said, there's a couple of construction workers that are staying in the trailers, so they'll be here till the morning. And if you need a place, there's an old car seat out there you can take and lay down on, and maybe the guys will let you stay in a trailer or something. Then the next morning, she got up, we went into the bar, we opened up. I was shooting pool with her for a couple hours, and then a couple of these guys came in, the construction workers, and then she started shooting pool with them. They didn't know if she had the gun with her or not, so they didn't want nothing happening inside the bar. So they waited for her to walk outside the bar. And they arrested her and took her away, and that was the last we ever seen about her.
Aileen Wuornos was arrested on January the 9th. Law enforcement struck a deal with Tyra Moore, granting her immunity if she would testify against her partner and convince Aileen to confess. Aileen admitted to the murder of 7 men, although she claimed she had killed them all in self-defense.
After Wuornos was arrested, she claimed that these men had raped her. And it's perfectly feasible that Wuornos had indeed been raped in the past. But it seems to me to be too coincidental that every one of her victims was trying to rape her.
So that was between the incident and trial invention. Her first statements to the police didn't indicate that at all. She had not told her friend Ty Moore that she'd ever been attacked. Even if she were afraid to tell the police, afraid they wouldn't believe her, she surely would have told her friend, her lover. Never mentioned it. She just simply pulled out her gun and pulled him off the road and killed him. 7 men in cold blood.
It's not unusual for a serial killer to confess to a crime and then backpedal. Oh, they made me angry, or they tried to attack me, or I had to protect myself. And then to go back and start confessing to another crime and then say, no, what I told you before is, no, I never told you that.
After 10 years on death row, Aileen Wuornos changed her story for the last time. She stated that she had not killed in self-defense. She had shot her 7 victims in cold blood.
She is said to be the first female serial killer in a non-caregiving capacity.
At her final hearing, she testified that if she's ever let loose, she would kill again, that if she was let into the prison yard, she would kill people, that she doesn't like people.
I think Aileen, true to someone who was mentally ill, just vacillated between, on the one hand, they were all self-defense. On the other hand, if you let me out, I'll kill again. On the other hand, the cops knew I was killing, and they let me continue to kill because the cops had book deals with the Hollywood interests. So I think towards the end, she just wanted to die. And indeed, towards the end, I think she waived all her appeals. Basically, it was what we call a volunteer.
On October the 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. So was Aileen Wuornos, herself the daughter of a convicted sex offender, a born killer? Or was she the twisted product of a childhood of abuse and loneliness, and a lifetime spent selling her body.
I mean, she was raised by a person she thought was her father, turned out to be a grandfather. Her father hung himself in prison. Her brother, Keith, who died tragically in 1976, there's been some suggestion, raped her. And I think by the time she's out in the highways and byways of Florida in 1991 doing these acts, yeah, she's unraveled at that point. To call her evil, I lean more towards she's just a product of her environment and her circumstances, and at a certain point, it came to what it was.
I knew she was messed up, but never did I ever think she'd commit murder.
Aileen is different. She may have been born to kill, but also that her environment acted so devastatingly on her that the combination of being born and the environment is unmistakable, leading to the murders.
She was hellbound, and she was on a course, a roller coaster of a life, which would ultimately end in some form of accident, death, or destruction to others.
She had so much going wrong in her young life that it would have been very difficult indeed for her to have prospered in the world, or indeed to have survived in our world. The way that she was brought up, the things that happened to her, how she was always on the margins of society, struggling even for something to eat, and to gain something that would nourish her through selling sexual services, seemed to me to write a script for Aileen Wuornos that was impossible to put down until the very last act. So whilst I'm not prepared to say that she was born to kill, I think in Aileen Wuornos's case, because of the script that she was handed, she was socialized to kill.
Aileen Wuornos robbed and killed 7 men. The press would christen her the Damsel of Death. But her best friend Dawn Botkins refuses to forget her good side.
Poor Aileen, after her horrible life, the teenager being bad, 20s being bad, 30s being bad, then death row, she wanted to go home to God. That's exactly what she did.
I put her ashes right around her tree when we got home. She wanted me to do that. And this is where she's at. And her tree's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I suppose she'll be here forever. And it's quiet, it's peaceful, nobody attacking her, nobody bothering her. She's very happy. This is exactly where she belongs. No other place but here.